In chess, you have 6 distinct pieces. All of them have their own movement, strategy, and most importantly, looks. And while the original designs look pretty nice, I wanted to spice them up a bit. So while I'm waiting for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC to release, I thought I would design a custom chess set based on the game Elden Ring. Since there are so many characters in Elden Ring, I often found multiple characters that could fit a certain chess piece. But for the pawn, there was really only one. Carrying parts of actual warriors in him and trying to become a warrior himself, Alexander the Jar was a perfect fit for the pawn. His broad design is rather simple, so the basic blockout didn't take that long. And after adding some bones and giving a more dynamic pose to him, the basic look of the piece was already in place. But I wanted to make it a bit more interesting, so I put him into an actual environment by replacing the flat base plate with this rough, broken down pavement. That immediately made it look much more immersive, especially once I added some more cracks and imperfections to a few of these stones. Lastly, to finish this first piece, I used a few more techniques to add some details to the base border and his body. Since we'll see these techniques again in more detail in some of the other pieces, let's skip them for now and just look at the finished version of the pawn. With all of these pieces, I tried to find characters that would represent the original as closely as possible. And somehow, Elden Ring has at least one character that fits almost perfectly for each one of these pieces. For the bishop, for example, which seems like a fairly specific one, there's a literal pasture tortoise called Muriel. A pasture is not exactly a bishop, but they both have a religious background, so I would say is close enough. I played around with various different base shapes to give the pieces a bit more character. For Muriel here, I went with this cross shape to represent the religious aspect as well as the health or healing aspect. Another difference to the first piece is how I blocked out Muriel's body. For this one, I decided to immediately block out the pose I had in mind, rather than just first adding bones and posing afterwards. But I was quickly regretting this decision. The biggest benefit of posing with bones is that you can block out the model with symmetry, meaning that the right side gets automatically mirrored to the left side. This is especially useful once you want to refine the model and add details to it, because even though you've added a non-symmetrical pose to it, you can still take advantage of the automatic mirroring. But since I didn't do that here, I had to refine both sides manually. That isn't a huge issue when you're just adding the broad shapes, but once you want to add fine details like the ridges and grooves on his shell, for example, you realize how much longer that will take. Luckily, sculpting him isn't super complex, so it didn't take too much time. And to add more character to the base, I wanted to recreate the environment he lies in right here by sculpting a patch of grass and some broken down walls. Lastly, to add some more depth to the grass, I added some individual blades, which don't make a huge difference, but still improve the overall look of this overgrown ruin. For this project, I wanted to get the easy pieces out of the way first. And there's one simple one left before we get to the big hitters. Finding a character that represents a literal tower would be pretty hard, but once again, somehow Elden Ring has the perfect character for this piece as well. The walking mausoleum is, well, a walking mausoleum. Basically a stone structure on a rock platform standing on rock legs. It is a pretty stiff character for obvious reasons, so to make this piece a bit more dynamic, I decided to add an environment with a small incline to the base. This way the legs can have just a little bit more variety in their shapes. Speaking of variety, the legs look a bit too smooth. Just like for Alexander, where his arms and legs have these small rocks on them, the mausoleum block out needs some more distinct boulders to recreate the original look. This refinement stage takes a few hours, but adds so much more character and realism to it that it's definitely worth it. The same is the case with this old tree sitting on the edge right here. It's just a small detail, but it's still important for the overall look. And with the main body done, the last thing that needs a glow up is the mausoleum. The general shape of it is already in place. Now all that's left is to cover the walls with details. Pillars and support beams on the edges, the spires to decorate the tops, and a lot of columns, arches and smaller structures to fill the rest. Luckily most sides look the same, so I was able to create one and duplicate it for the others. The last thing missing is the huge bell underneath the main platform. When you're running around in the world, you'll know that a mausoleum is around by hearing the bell ringing in the distance before you even see it. So adding it here is important since it's such a big part of the character. And with all that in place, the third and last simple piece is finished. Now we get to the ones that took the majority of this project's time. The knight piece is represented by a horse. For this one I had a few potential picks, but the one that fits the most in my opinion is the tree sentinel. You'll encounter him right when you enter the open world for the first time and is probably the first boss you fought if you've played the game yourself. Since he is called the tree sentinel, I thought it would only be fitting to use a tree stump for the base. And this model from Sketchfab right here was a pretty good start. I've never sculpted a horse before, so I was a bit unsure with the anatomy and proportions in general. There are a lot of similarities in the anatomy of animals, but some parts like the legs or the neck are quite different compared to humans, for example. Using a few references, creating a block art wasn't too bad, and this time I also added a skeleton so I could keep the symmetry intact for as long as possible. And to speed up the process a little bit, I used a base mesh for the sentinel's body since he is covered in full armor anyway, so modeling his body from scratch would just be a waste of time. The armor was by far the thing that took the longest to create, which I knew beforehand. So before I get into that ordeal, I refined the horse block out so I can fit the armor onto the actual final body. Modeling armor isn't too difficult. You start with the broad shapes first to create the general structure, break up those smaller shapes if needed, and refine it with some details like on the edges right here. As I said, it's not super difficult, it's just very tedious. Especially for this guy, which has plating over plating over plating. And then you do the same process once again for the horse and the axe and of course the shield. 20.5 hours later, the armor was almost done. Almost. There was one more thing I did to add some small details to most of the armor pieces, and it's actually something I've already used for Alexander. To recreate these detailed patterns on the jar, I redrew them in Photoshop and then applied them to the model as a displacement map. Black on the texture means to lower the surface and white means to raise it. This way you can pretty easily create these very detailed surfaces without having to sculpt them yourself. On the tree sentinel armor, for example, I used this floral pattern that I found on Flip Normals, which comes pretty close to the original. And the difference this made to the overall look of the armor is pretty crazy. Now we get to the two most important pieces. To really elevate these two from the rest, the first thing I did was to just raise them a bit higher by making the base plates taller. When it comes to who will be king and queen, there wasn't really a debate for me. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, doesn't just look cool with his spirit lion on his shoulder, but he is literally called the first Elden Lord. Since he was a warrior in the past and took on the lion Serosh to keep his bloodlust in check, I wanted to give his base a more aggressive shape, so I went with a pentagon. It's supposed to represent a castle with these multi-layered walls and give the piece a more royal look. I used the same human base mesh again to create Godfrey's body, but since I don't have a lion-human hybrid base mesh, surprisingly, this stage of the block art looked a bit weird. But after sculpting a quick lion head and mane, the overall look comes together quite well. Now it was once again time to model some armor, but I think we've seen enough of that already. Well, maybe a little bit more. What's new for this piece is the hair. The lion obviously has a lot of it, but even Godfrey has a nice head of hair on him. For the general shape and structure, I created a quick sculpt just to nail the proportions and style. The sculpt will not only serve as a first layout, but also as a guide for this part right here, where I use these individual curves to add some more structure to it. The sculpt itself is still quite smooth and flat. With these curves, we can now add some more three-dimensionality, which will make it look a lot more realistic and believable. At first they will look kind of out of place, but the more you add, the better it will look. And the same goes for Godfrey's hair. Since this process can take a while, I decided to only add these curves to his hair and not his beard. Once he is the size of a regular chess piece, you won't see these small details that well anyway. And that leaves us with one last chess piece. It only really makes sense to use Queen Marika for the queen piece. Not only because she has queen literally in her title, but also because most of the game revolves around her and her actions. During my research, I found this really cool artwork of Marika by Daniel Camaruden that I thought could work really well as a chess piece as well. Her standing in the arms of Malekith, which is bound to her as a spirit and supposed to guard a part of the Elden Ring. For all the pieces, I tried to avoid that the characters reach further than the base itself, except in some small areas to make sure that when you place them on a chessboard, they don't extend too far onto other tiles. With the concept I had in mind, this was actually pretty difficult. I tried a few different poses and positions, but it was hard to find something that doesn't reach too far over the base. At the end, I just decided to remove Malekith's lower half and turn it into this smoky spirit body that wraps around the base. As you've seen with the other pieces already, one constant goal was to make them all 3D printable, so you can, actually use them. I've designed them to fit onto a competitive chessboard tile size of 2.5 inches. It was an interesting challenge to fit especially the last two characters onto such a small space, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And if you have a 3D printer and want to get these for yourself, check out the first link in the description. Even if you don't play chess, you could also just print them in a bigger format to put them as statues on your shelf. Anyway, the process of creating these two was very similar to the other pieces. The biggest change was actually in Malekith's sword and both of their hair. At first I tried the same method I used for the Mausoleum and Alexander to give the sword that rocky look. But that didn't really work out that well, so I just sculpted it manually without all the extra rock pieces, and that looked 1,000 times better. Lastly, for the hair, I refined the sculpt a lot more. I used it to establish the general structure and only added curves afterwards in select spots to create some strands that move away from the main body of hair. This was a much faster way of working and looks very similar compared to the Godfrey hair, so I'll probably just do this from now on. Lastly, I used a few more curves to create her tiara and other jewelry, and added the same details to Malekith's sword that I used for the Tree Sentinel armor. And with the queen done, the full chess set is complete. If you're a bit more skilled than me with refining 3D prints, here's the concept of what a full chessboard of these pieces could look like. This brass finish adds a nice secondary color that I think also works pretty well with the theme of Elden Ring. I wanted to do another 3D print project for a while now, and I'm really happy with how this one turned out. And once again, if you want to get this set for yourself, check out the first link in the description.